Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world, welcome back to The Caring Economy with me, Toby Usnik, your host. Today, we have the privilege of interviewing Amy Freitag. She is the president of the New York Community Trust. It's one of the oldest and largest and most influential community foundations in the United States. The trust has been at the forefront of critical issues from the start, including things that have shaped the history of the city, such as environmental justice, economic inequality, and equalizing access to the arts and LGBTQ plus rights. As the trust celebrates the centennial anniversary this year, we're honored to have her on the show to talk about her own personal and remarkable journey and the profound impact that the trust has had in shaping New York City's social landscape over the past century. With a legacy of catalyzing pivotal projects, addressing critical issues, and uniting generous New Yorkers with high impact nonprofits, it's going to be a fun one. Welcome to The Caring Economy, Amy Freitag.
Oh, Toby, it's such a treat to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
You and I were talking before we came on here. We have a mutual friend and colleague in common, now past, Joan Davidson, who was such a great force. I think we should dedicate this session to her.
And we should say Excelsior.
Excelsior.
Joan was an amazing woman, and I will always cherish the time that I got to spend working with her and her family.
I couldn't agree more. She was a neighbor and friend. We belonged to a couple of different organizations, the Century here in New York and the Tivoli's Edgewood Club. And she was just always such a hero in so many ways. But why don't we use this as an intro to you, Amy? Why don't you give us a little bit, maybe a 2 or 3 minute sort of overview of your
Sure.
life narrative, your career journey, and where that intersected with Joan?
Well, I'll tell you, I feel blessed because I grew up in the heartland of Ohio. I'm from Akron, Ohio. I still have a ton of family there. And that's one of the towns that really has benefited so richly from a really terrific community foundation. So, and that's really in the shadow of the Cleveland Foundation, which is the original community foundation. So I grew up in a place where philanthropy and community philanthropy in particular were pretty important. I also grew up in a family that was really committed to its community and our neighborhood and our environment, our reproductive rights, I grew up with a family that not only loved to volunteer, but my mom would dutifully write $20 checks to every single nonprofit that she believed in. And so we kind of grew up being told, it's not enough just to be here. You have to volunteer and you have to give back. So I think a lot of what has driven my career is really rooted in my family. Um, and then, part of what made our town great is that we had great arts, and I spent a lot of time working in our community theater, and theater became my passion. Theater drove me to Smith College for my undergraduate degree. Theater drove me to New York City for every summer vacation, spring break I could to see theater. And ultimately, when I graduated from Smith, I moved to New York and worked at BAM, which is the Brooklyn Academy of Music, at an extraordinary moment when the Next Wave Festival was in its full
Mhm.
bloom. And so I did work in nonprofit theater and commercial theater on Broadway, which was really exciting in the production side of Broadway. Um, but ultimately, I think you grow into and out of certain things. I still have a passion for theater, but I think when I kind of got into the world of commercial theater, I realized it wasn't really where I wanted to be. And
Mhm.
it gave me an opportunity to pivot to some other passions of mine, which include historic things and environmental things, and ultimately to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, where I studied historic preservation and landscape architecture. So there's a weird through line there that we can talk about, but I do think historic places are very theatrical places. And
Um,
so I think I got caught in this idea of the theatricality of American historic places. And then I ended up doing work in historic preservation in Philadelphia, which has fabulous historic places and historic landscapes, coming back to New York City to do similar work with the New York City Parks Department Historic Houses, where I first encountered Joan, who was the great champion of Gracie Mansion.
mhm.
Um, Great trip working at the Parks Department and running the Historic House Trust. And luckily for me, one of the great mentors in my life, Adrian Benepe, was then the Manhattan Borough Commissioner, and I was appointed Parks Commissioner by Mike Bloomberg.
Mhm.
And Mike not only gave Adrian the opportunity to leave, Adrian gave me the opportunity to be his deputy commissioner for design and construction of New York City parks. So I had that unbelievable ride at a moment when more money was being spent, thanks to Mayor Bloomberg, on parks and open space than any time since the WPA.
Mhm.
So we were building the High Line, and we were building Brooklyn Bridge Park and restoring Washington Square. So just actually kind of a glory time to do that work. Um, 3 children later, it was clear that it was too much job to have small children at the same time. So I transitioned from that work to some international work and heritage preservation at the World Monuments Fund,
Hmm.
and worked for a family foundation, which really laid the pathway to the J.M. Kaplan Fund and ultimately to the New York Community Trust. Oh,
Mhm.
and by the way, I did have a stint working with Bette Midler and the New York Restoration Project in there as well, planting 1 million trees with the Bloomberg administration. So it's been a fun and diverse ride of nonprofits, environmental, arts, and historic preservation that bring me to this unbelievable opportunity of being only the 4th president in 100 years of the New York Community Trust.
Amazing.
Period.
That's a great synopsis. We should point out for the listeners that the Kaplan Fund is the one that Jones family is responsible for.
Yeah.
Um, you know, our worlds are colliding big time here. I and all my 4 brothers were born in Akron General Hospital.
Stop it.
We used
Stop it, Toby.
to
We're
play
living
outside
parallel lives.
in Portage Lakes at my grandfather's house. And I we didn't grow up there after a while. My parents moved, but that was fascinating. And I did my graduate work at Penn in university administration. So I came
Very
here
cool.
35 years ago from Philadelphia and share the same love of Philly as you do, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's a great, great city. Great resources there.
yeah. I wonder if you might say a little bit then about the trust and its mission and why you're so proud to be there.
Oh, I have to tell you, it is such an extraordinary organization. So, interestingly, 100 years ago, little more than 100 years ago, the Cleveland Foundation had this big idea that, with all the prosperity that was happening in that part of the country during the sort of industrial boom of, for me in Akron, it was the tire industry, in Cleveland, steel, that there was a lot of wealth being generated, and that wealth was being held in trust, often as charitable bequests to back to the city and the community where the wealth was generated. And so many of the banks in Cleveland held those charitable assets, but they were great at managing the money, but not very good at, they realized they weren't the best people to assess what were the needs of the community.
Right.
So this really brilliant guy had this idea that we should just pool all those assets and give them to a distribution committee to make the best choices for health, for environment, for arts. And indeed, that was the model that we copied, and we are celebrating 100 years of that
Mm.
origin of community philanthropy in New York. So the trust is an extraordinary organization that not only makes a lot of grants out of those charitable bequests that we hold, we also hold donor advised funds for living donors who
Mhm.
want to make an impact during their lifetimes on how their community is evolving. So we have a great interaction between grantees that we support through our permanent or endowed funds, living donors making grants, not just in New York and the 8 counties that we serve, but across the country. We began as a 5 borough community foundation,
Mhm.
and over the many years of life of the New York Community Trust, we actually created the Maine Community Foundation, the Fairfield, Connecticut Community Foundation, Berkshire Taconic, all evolved out of the New York Community Trust. But we never let go of Long Island and Westchester, and I'm so glad we didn't, because I think being 8 counties strong for the New York Community Trust gives us a really powerful sort of platform to talk about climate, affordability. So we are celebrating this 100 years as the New York Community Trust, 8 counties strong, serving 12.4 million New Yorkers who reside in those 8 counties.
So real quickly, if anyone wants to be in touch to consider creating a donors advised fund or just learn more, what's the best URL or way to
Oh,
follow?
to our brand new website, just Google New York Community Trust and it'll take you there. The New York Trust .org is a brand new, literally, Toby, we launched it 2 weeks ago, our new website, our new branding. We kind of felt like our 100th birthday was a really good excuse to put a fresh face on the New York Community Trust. We'd been using the same acronym NYCT since, would you believe FDR was still in the White House?
I
One of
did.
Joan Davidson's favorites, FDR.
Right. That's right.
And but we felt like in a very, and we can talk about this, I think community foundations are a really extraordinary machine of community generosity, but not everybody understands them very well. And in a crowded place like New York City, to be more visible and accessible as the New York Community Trust, New York's Community Foundation, we felt it was important to lean into our name. So you'll
Mhm.
hear us and see us now as the New York Community Trust, or the shorthand, the Trust.
I love that, and it makes sense. I wonder, do you have maybe just a general number of how many community trusts there are across the United States?
So it turns out that that idea in Cleveland just grew like wildfire. I'll say like wildflowers across the country. There are over 900 community foundations. And like we like to say about family philanthropy, when you've seen one, you've seen one. They're very different.
Exactly. So
Community
true.
foundations can vary a lot, and vary a lot in size, and in approach. But I would say that we are in a extraordinary, and that's one thing I think that we are excited about at this moment, at this sort of 100th anniversary of community foundations,
Mhm.
is that we recognize we have a lot in common, and by working in better alignment across the country, we can have some extraordinary impact. Let me
Mm.
give you an example of that, which is our work we're doing right now in climate. We're working with 50 community foundations across the country in something called the Community Foundation Climate Collaborative, with the effort of trying to give the federal government that's funding so richly our need to quickly catch up with
Mhm.
climate mitigation and adaptation, through several large infrastructure bills that have been passed, to try to help that money get all the way to the ground where the communities that will suffer the worst impacts of climate change reside. So as you know, you may know, the New York Community Trust has been working in the environment and environmental justice for decades. So
Mhm.
we feel like we're really good at helping get those dollars to their maximum impact on the ground. That's how our colleagues feel in Denver. That's how our colleagues feel in Marin. That's where, so the idea of this climate collaborative is to work across the country to make us a really easy partner to both federal government and private philanthropy, because we all have to move quickly if we're going to address, the climate
Yeah.
change crisis that's
You
upon us.
you mentioned that one of the community trusts that you helped spawn was Fairfield County, Connecticut. But
Yeah.
is New Jersey also one of them? Is there so how do you work with New Jersey since it's right across the river and we
Oh,
share?
it's so great you asked me that. And we've been recently in conversation with our friends at the New Jersey Community Foundation, run by a fabulous guy named Hans Decker. We have talked to them a lot around issues related to some of the climate work. We've talked about collaborative grant making, when we've applied for some of those federal funds. There are all kinds of issues that impact between New Jersey and New York. And one of the things I'm hoping we can do even more of is not only leaning into our regional partnerships like New Jersey, but to really work in alignment with the community foundations across the state.
Mhm.
62 counties, each of them have some community foundation worrying about them or trying to support them. And the idea that when you are trying to welcome 180,000 migrants into New York City, it's not just got to be a welcoming city, it's got to be a welcoming state. And there are
Mhm.
parts of the state that are really suffering with population loss and with a lack of workers for
Mhm.
really critical need jobs in social services and hospitality in agriculture. So we feel like if we work in alignment with our community foundation partners across the state, we'll be super effective in trying to help the city cope with this pretty extraordinary flow
Absolutely.
of immigrants coming in at this moment in New York City.
And how does the community foundation or trust rather work with government? How do community trusts in general work with local and federal government or state government?
Well, look, I think our work right now, in partnership with the Robin Hood Foundation around immigration, we've kicked off an effort to work in partnership with Robin Hood, but the real partnership is between philanthropy and state government, city government, because when we realize, looking back over 100 years of work, when we work collaboratively with government, we are so much more effective, right? If we
Mhm.
have good lines of communication and good sort of resource sharing and understanding of where the gaps are. We should not do government's job, but there's some things philanthropy can do with real expedience and efficiency in a way that government can.
Yeah.
Often what we can do, for example, is pilot a new idea that can then get picked up by government and taken to scale. So having good lines of communication as we are in right now, I think very effectively working with both the Adams administration and the Hochul administration to understand where their pain points are, how we can be of assistance. And we've had terrific response from philanthropy to try to support the city through this moment of increased flow of what we call the newest New Yorkers.
I love that turn of phrase, along with wildflowers spreading. Ladies and gentlemen, again today on the Caring Economy, we're thrilled to have Amy Freitag with us. She's president of the New York Community Trust, one of the oldest and largest and most influential trusts, and thankfully not the only one across the country with, I guess you said, almost 900 or more, right?
Yeah. And there's a really good rapport. I think there's different ways that community foundations across the country collaborate. And we work. And what's very cool, Toby, I think is especially exciting, you know, how the Great Resignation happened across many sectors. Of
Yeah.
the top 40 community foundations, over half of us are new in our seats in the last 24 months. So it's just a lot of innovation and opportunity for thinking anew about what community philanthropy looks like in this century. And so just really collaborative group of people out there that are a lot of fun to work with.
Yeah. Well, also you said at the opening about how, this local, hyper local philanthropy and the involvement of the people who are most, the residents really of those communities, how important that is. And it does seem to me local and cities and state governments, that's where the action is now. I mean, there's
Yeah,
just federal
yeah,
government can only do so much, right? And you
yeah.
see how these collaborations, and it's got to be all hands on deck. It can't just be foundations or
Mhm.
businesses or elected. So I think your solution, so to speak, is the ideal one for the times we're living in because there's
I,
greater appetite for experimenting and collaborating.
and I just love this idea, Toby. I couldn't agree with you more. I feel like it's this great idea that's come again into flower at a moment when we have such a lot of challenge in our communities, and the idea that we can, and it's also, you know, I've heard you talk in other podcasts a lot about this like moment of polarization. To me, community foundations are the great collective sort of meeting place where we can come together, sort of like the public commons of our community, where we may not agree on every topic, but we can all agree we want New York to be the best place it can be. And we can all find a project and a way to lean into that. And that's what I love about the community foundations at this moment, the sort of post-COVID recovery moment. There's a myriad needs, but there's so many people who want to help. New Yorkers are so generous. And
Mm.
we've seen that time and time again, whether it was post 9/11 when the New York Community Trust raised a $500 million in partnership with the United Way, whether it was after Superstorm Sandy, or even in the recent COVID emergency when we were able to work with other philanthropy, including our friends at Ford, including our friends at Bloomberg, including lots of individual donors who came together to raise an $80 million fund that we were able to deploy within just weeks of the city and state's closure. So it becomes a centering point for philanthropy and response and community action that I think is very of this moment.
Absolutely. Amy, I'm wondering if on the centennial celebration, you could share some of the milestones in the trust's history that are illustrative of what we're discussing.
Oh, I'm happy to. I mean, first of all, what an honor to celebrate 100 years of community philanthropy. Fast forward to, you know, the grants that we made. One of my favorite is that we had a donor who left us a fund in the 1940s to study diseases. And then suddenly when AIDS broke out in New York City, and as you may recall, the whole AIDS crisis was a little radioactive for community, for all philanthropy. But we had this fund that was tailor-made to study a blood disease, and we were among the first to make grants to study the AIDS virus. So to me, that's one of a bunch of stories about the way that the trust has been in the right place at the right time to make the really critical grants. And look, what I frequently will tell people, the trust isn't necessarily going to be the biggest funder or the funder of longest duration, but man, we'll be in there early on, and we will be the venture risk capital for a new nonprofit that maybe we can be the good housekeeping seal of approval to lower the barriers so other philanthropy can feel more comfortable jumping in.
Mhm.
And that could be one of the first grants to the Highline. That could
Mhm.
be one of the first grants to one of my favorite organizations, the New York City LGBTQ Historic Sites Project.
Mhm.
There's a myriad examples of that where the trust took an early bet on a nonprofit. And that's because we have this whole group of really dialed in, very smart grant makers who work close to the ground and have their ears open and really have trusted relationships in the nonprofit community so that we can be there at those critical moments where we can really push the organization to a new level of impact.
Mhm. Yeah, I remember a question I was going to ask you, which is about donors, donor advised funds, DAFs. It does seem to me that one of your secret sauces is the ability to really offer bespoke solutions to people who want to help, want to fund, want to care, but don't necessarily want their hands fully tied in a moment in time.
Sure.
Is that a fair statement? And maybe you can refresh our collective memory about DAFs and how they work, because it's a fairly new phenomenon, I think.
It's a fabulous vehicle, although it is new, but I'm going to take a little pride in saying that the New York Community Trust sort of created the first donor advised fund in 1931.
Um,
1931. Now there are 2 million DAFs in America. So a donor advised fund, let me speak mostly to how it works at a community foundation, because that's obviously what I'm most familiar with. But a donor who wants to, let's say, has a moment where they have the additional resources to put towards philanthropy, but they're not exactly sure that what they want to give to, and they maybe don't want to give it all at once. So
mhm,
they can open a donor advised fund for a very low level at the New York Community Trust, like $1,500,
mhm,
but it can be obviously up to any amount of money, and that they get a charitable deduction at the creation of the donor advised fund. And then they can take their time in figuring out, by working through us, and we have a fabulous donor portal where you can go online, say, I'd like to give money to the Central Park Conservancy. And that organization is one we give a lot of grants to, thanks to our donor advisors. And we do all the due diligence on that nonprofit. We know the Central Park Conservancy for a long time,
mhm,
but we study them, keep an eye on their financials, make sure it's a great grantee, and then you just tell us how much you want to make the grant for. We do all the work.
mhm,
It also affords a level of anonymity for some donors who might not want to be so visibly giving. Um, we feel like it's been one of the great democratizers of philanthropy in
mhm,
America.
mhm.
Honestly, Toby, our average fund balance for a donor advised fund is like $50,000, and our average grant size might be 1,500. But of course, we have donor advisors who make very large scale grants.
Mhm.
But the idea that it's a very low barrier, you don't have to have a family foundation. You don't need to have a private foundation to give in a really professional way through a donor
Yeah.
advised fund.
I mean, Harlan and I created one this year with our financial with to the matter with him, but to your point, not only do you not have to have a family office or a 501(c)(3), I think it's better that we don't create more family offices and 501(c)(3)s, that we work with
Yeah.
established organizations that are already giving the scale and the
Yeah.
professionalism that you
It
need.
just means more of your money gets put to charitable purpose. And then what's really cool is that we put out guidance all the time to our donor advisors. Some want it, some don't. Some people may not want to give um, only in New York City or in the 8 counties that we serve, Long Island, Westchester. But the idea that we put out, for example, just today, we're going to release a Pride Month giving guidelines. And what we try to do is we try to celebrate a lot of the great nonprofits. We don't flood you with 100 options. We try to give a kind of bespoke list of organizations that we think are critical right now. And we'll do that for Hispanic Heritage Month, and we'll do that for Black History Month, and we'll do it throughout the year. And if you just want to pick up the phone and say, you know what, Amy, I really want to give to hunger, and I just don't know the best organizations, we'll put somebody on the phone with you to really give you that guidance. So we sometimes do a lot of very bespoke donor advising. In fact, we can set up a whole grant making program for a donor. It kind of depends what any individual donor wants, and that's what I think is great about a community foundation. We can really meet our donors wherever they are, whether they want a light touch or a much more engaged relationship with the trust.
Terrific. And can you say a little bit about the measuring of impact and how you and your members are, would you call them members or,
Donor advisors, yeah. Look,
well, the people who put their money with you, do you call those
yes, our
the
donors. So,
donors?
so I think lots of people have different approaches to this, and what we're kind of excited about is trying to meet our not only our donors where they are, but our grantees where they are. And what we recognize is that philanthropy over time has been both an asset to the nonprofit community, but they can also be a lot of work for the nonprofit community. So we tend to do our measurement working with our really outstanding grant makers who are able to work collaboratively with our grantees to evaluate their impact. We do not have a sort of an imposed methodology on how people have to measure, because as you know, we fund every topic within the 8 counties, right? So I always say we do cats to cancer, from climate to whatever you want to say. So, how we measure impact across these subject areas with different size organizations
Yeah.
is a really complex thing. So again, we try to do it in a way that gives our donors a real understanding of what's happening, but we don't try to impose a big rubric or a challenge and administratively challenging measures that our grantees have to meet.
Yeah, we often hear this in philanthropy about particularly smaller nonprofits, how the burden, all the paperwork and
Yeah.
such is just so prohibitive. I wonder if you could say about trends that you're seeing, maybe like we talked about the immigrant crisis a bit, but what else are you seeing right now in terms of what's up, what's down in terms of the engagement of your donors?
Well, look, I think affordability, a huge issue. And we're
Affordability.
really excited to explore. We have done some work around impact investing that has included affordable housing. I think there's just great need and great opportunity in that area. We're really interested in issues like childcare. The affordability crisis has so many elements and dimensions to it. We've thought a lot and are thinking a lot about the challenges of parenting, especially for families that are stressed by poverty, and the challenges specifically families of color have faced with just trying to have their kids live healthy and successful lives when they're heavily sort of policed in some cases by the agencies, which of course we want child protection, but are we treating all families equally? So we're thinking a lot about child welfare and families, and how families need to be given a certain amount of trust and equal rights under the law in terms of their ability to parent their children. We're thinking a lot about climate and climate justice, and
Mhm.
recognizing that as I was saying, in some of our most resource constrained neighborhoods, they're also the ones that are going to have the most heat related death. So what are we able to do in terms of climate mitigation, tree planting, all of the things that we need to think about to make our community evolve as healthfully as possible in a moment of climate change. So there's literally a sort of unlimited need in some of these categories. And what's cool about the trust is that we try through some really thoughtful strategies to come up with really actionable ways that both our individual donors and our grant making team can make real advances, even in something as huge and challenging as the Department of Education. And let me give you an example of that. So we were really honored by the New York Attorney General's office by being selected as one of the recipients of Brooke Astor's estate. You may recall that at the
Mm.
end of her life,
Yep.
the
Tony
Attorney
Marshall.
General had to set in and allocate some of her estate to charitable purpose. And knowing that Brooke Astor had a long and abiding interest in children and education, we established a fund devoted to children and reading in New York City. And it took a decade, and it took a lot of research and a lot of policy work and a lot of support of this myriad nonprofits who have been thinking a long time about a system that was leaving 2/3 of Black and brown kids reading under grade level, just
Mm.
not acceptable. And what were the drivers of that, and what were the challenges of that? Fast forward a decade later, you heard last year that the school's chancellor announced a new curriculum for reading in New York City.
Mhm.
And we can see evidence of our grant making over a decade and some of that decision making. And even better, Toby, than last January, the governor announced that the state, so a total of 2.4 million kids would learn reading under new curriculum. That's the kind of patient, smart grant making that has been the brand of the New York Community Trust for
Mhm.
decades and decades. And that's why, to me, if you want to have impact with your donor advised fund in New York City, you want to hang out with the New York Community Trust.
Here, here. I also just like overall the philosophy of taking a long view, right? Like these
Yeah.
things are quick fixes that you collaborate with others is core to the solutions because it can't be on any one person. I'm reminded when Mark Zuckerberg thought he could change education, I think in the Newark schools, and without working with the teachers unions, you can't just pilot, parachute in and out. Well, three things come to mind to me right now, and I'm mindful of time, but there's polarization, there's the war in Gaza, there's AI. I wonder, are you seeing action by your donors or trends in any of those areas, or any thoughts on any of those?
I mean, sure. I think we see a lot of grant making energy around issues related to communities under pressure, right? And we also see the impact overall on our nonprofit community, dealing with the stresses of that conflict that's happening so far away, but
Yeah.
certainly being felt locally. We are fascinated with the impact of AI and the possibility of it being both, an asset to nonprofits who are always resource constrained. And there are several efforts in motion right now trying to help nonprofits gain traction with AI to help them do their work better.
Mhm.
So we're interested in that not only for our grantees, but also for our own operation. What does it mean to be a community foundation for this century? And
Mhm.
how can we deploy technology to make that matching between donors and grantees even more powerful? So
Yeah.
I think it's a brave new world of opportunity out there. Of course, there's also a lot of concern about the impacts of AI and its negative aspects, but I think we're all learning and growing together with those
Mhm.
technologies.
Yeah. I've been very bullish on it. I've been teaching courses on AI for social impact, just the large language models
Yeah.
for the past year and a half, just informally, because I want people to engage with the technology. We have to be conversant if we're going to shape it. If we
Yeah.
don't, then we're outsourcing that to others who might not be as human-centered or as
Yeah.
responsible.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to hear that from you. I'm mindful of the time. Amy, we have our last question is always pearls of wisdom. I wonder if you might share with us what you've gleaned in your illustrious career about both and or leading a purpose-driven life or a purpose-driven career.
Well, look, we started this conversation thinking about a great person, and that what I love about this organization of the New York Community Trust, it's a people business, and people are the essence, right? Building relationship and community, connecting people. This is why I think community foundations as a model are so powerful, and why the New York Community Trust has been such a change maker in our region, because we have effectively been convening and pulling together people, not only in their lifetimes, but across generations. So we bring, for example, we are one of the largest donors of disability in our region. That's because of an actor who was the most famous actor in New York in 1920. His name was David Warfield, and sadly, he was not only the most famous but the wealthiest actor in the world in his lifetime. And he became blind at the end of his life. And he left this incredibly generous bequest that now funds extraordinary free eye care for people. We'll go to settlement houses in the South Bronx and northern Manhattan, where 84% of the people will fail their eye exam, and they get free eye care because of David Warfield. That's a human being. That was a person, and we are connecting him. His bequest was left in the 1950s to people in need today. So the power of people, the power of connecting people, and that, you know, in a moment where I think we've all gotten really accustomed, and you and I are meeting right now through Zoom,
Yeah.
I can't wait to be in person with you and being and making the effort to be in person and in relationship is the essence of what a community foundation is. And it's kind of what we all, I think, at this moment need is
Here.
is to address that moment of polarization. We can all find something we share in common. Let's find a way to build the bridges.
Absolutely. And also, I would just say, I mean, you are all about good governance as well, right? Like in a
Yeah.
day and age when people want to dispute that there are two versions of truth or have differing points of view, governance is governance, right? And how you manage people's money responsibly, transparently, and with, you know, audits and all that, that stuff really matters.
No, it does. And that's the legacy that we get to stand on is 100 years of real integrity and fidelity and following a donor's wishes. And I can tell you, I sit in these extraordinary meetings at the New York Community Trust where we will give substantial discussion over the $2,000 bequest that was left to us 80 years ago. We give it absolutely as much attention as the multi-million-dollar fund that was left by somebody else. So to us, it's about honoring people and honoring the legacy and the trust they've put in us.
In a place called New York and its surroundings.
Exactly. Exactly.
Amy Freitag, president of the New York Community Trust, celebrating your 100th anniversary at the Trust. I want to thank you so much for coming on the Caring Economy, and I can't wait for our next chat because we've got so much more to delve into.
Great. Toby, you're the best. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.